Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or someone you know would be interested in coming on the show and chatting with me, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin, or you can reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin at fosandon.org. All right, so we had something really funny happen right before I clicked the let's go button, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about all sorts of things, but specifically this with my guest. So, my guest today is Jeremy Miller. Jeremy, what just happened?
So we're about to get ready. Our family dog is sitting with me. He's as calm as he can possibly be. They're putting Google Fiber in our neighborhood, and a
Uh-huh.
work truck pulled up where they are digging and drilling into our front yard. And our dog
Mm.
is obsessive about our front yard, so he's going bonkers in the other room right as we start, of course.
Yeah, no, it's funny because when a dog starts barking, there's one of two things in my experience. They want attention, or they see something that they want to attack immediately, right? Whether it's a person, a squirrel, whatever, right? So it's always funny. And I don't know what kind of dog you had, but he sounded like a very friendly dog, but a very excited dog too.
So our dog Chewy also knows when I start talking to the screen, he
Yeah.
knows that I'm not going to play with him anytime soon. He'll
Yeah.
almost always demand to go out. So he's on a lot of work calls with me.
Well, I mean, he's welcome to join if he wants. So, but with that, Jeremy Miller, do you want to give a quick intro before we kind of get started with the conversation?
Well, sure. So, like I said, I'm Jeremy Miller. You can find me at jeremydmiller.com. Still on Twitter, still Jeremy D. Miller at Twitter. I can't remember my Mastodon name offhand.
No worries.
So I've been doing .NET for about 20 years, been a professional developer for about 25. Um, and I've actually been doing open source software since 2004.
You forgot the lead. What do you do right now?
Oh man, yeah, I'm slow. So yeah, I'm still getting used to this. So I'm the owner and CEO of a company called Jasper FX Software. We're trying, and it is a we now. It's not just me. Thank you. So we're trying to build a sustainable business model around some open source tooling offerings on the .NET platform. So what we colloquially call the critter stack.
Yep.
Marten, that's an event sourcing and document database library on top of Postgres. And then another tool called Wolverine that's just turning into kind of an overarching application framework, but works with Marten, gives you a full event-driven architecture, messaging, HP endpoints. And if you really have to do it this way, it could be just a mediator clone.
Yeah, I mean, so for what it's worth, so Jeremy and I were kind of in the speaker circuit together, and if I'm not wrong, you were in the process of making this decision the last time I saw you at NDC last year, right? You were kind of, yeah.
Boy, I think I was just maybe. Oh yeah, I think I was about 2 weeks from starting the new business. I'd already
Yeah.
already established the paperwork. I'd already given notice at my previous job. I was maybe just like a week or two later is when I started full time. So yeah, good memory.
Yeah, I remember because I remember talking to you, and you were like, "Well, I'm kind of making a big thing," and you give me kind of a little hint. I mean, when anybody says let's be clear, when somebody is well known in the open source space, and that opens and they have a particular project that's taken off, there becomes a conversation. I think it's a great thing that we should talk about maybe later on the stream. It's like this thing could probably make a little bit of money, and that we have people that are using it, and they need an extra level of support, right? And you were kind of hinting at that, and I was like, oh, I know what you're doing, and I'm looking forward to learning more. But I think that and I'd love to talk about that as we get forward a little bit later in the chat. But I love hearing folks' origin stories. So do you remember when technology first introduced itself to you, and you were like, yeah, this is it. This is what I like doing. This is something that I could definitely make a life, or at least an enjoyment or a hobby out of.
So I'm a late bloomer in that regard. So if you talk to people that are my age and you ask them what was your favorite computer, and they'll bring up some obscure 80s thing you've never heard of, right?
Depending on how
But
old they are, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've had plenty of guests
yeah,
that are like, yeah, no, like some combination of letters and numbers, and I'm like, okay, that sounds like a cool thing. I don't know what that is, but
that's okay. I never know what those are either. So, I never had a computer around at home. You had them a little bit in high school, barely. When I got to college, I was a real engineering major, not software engineering, but real mechanical engineering. And
mechanical. Okay.
yeah, and I didn't really pay enough attention at the time, but I very clearly enjoyed what little programming we did,
Mm-hmm.
MATLAB, and even I'm old enough it was Fortran sometimes.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it, but I didn't pay attention to it, and I still came out as a programmer. Fast forward to the late '90s when I was a professional engineer, and the dot-com boom hit hard. The
Mm.
original boom before the first bust, and I was kind of looking around. I was already starting to do a little bit of programming just to automate some of my engineering work. So late '90s, I started taking things like Access 97, reverse engineered, learned how to do ASP Classic, started writing Office VBA stuff for my engineering group. So I was shadow IT in the late '90s. That is the least cool software developer origin story
No,
possible.
man. Let me like this is a hot take that I've had for a long time, and like I think people, so like depending on how old you are, you either agree with like Fury or you disagree with Fury. I think from like 1996 to 2004 is like the golden age of technology. I think that there is no better time to like get started as a developer or to be in technology than that time. Obviously, money was very, very good because of .com, but you think of like the tools that were introduced during that time that like literally are still used today. You mentioned Access, Excel, Classic ASP, like that becomes .NET, but like there's still a lot of Classic ASP stuff out there. Classic ASP also kind of stems the way for like your PHPs of the world, right? So like, and you get like this. We were talking a little bit earlier on stream before we got started about like how fast tech was moving,
Yeah.
like very very like if you were just paying attention, you just learned something new like every 2 or 3 months that was like vital to your job. And like there wasn't a huge learning curve for a lot of it yet, where I think now we're getting to the point where if people are new to tech, like there's this very steep learning curve. Like you learn programming language 101, and then you go into this, and then all of a sudden like you're doing Kubernetes, and it's like, okay, is that really my job?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll stop, but like I'd love to get your thoughts as like that 8 year
Well,
window.
so I would agree with that. I mean, a lot of it, the tools were easier to use. The tools were much less capable, but they were
Yes.
easier to
Yes.
use.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, our procedures, our engineering discipline was also a lot less because I used to write Oracle stored procedures on the production
Mm-hmm.
database.
Mm-hmm.
Used to edit ASP Classic pages on a production website. Kids don't do that today.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of the tools for the first time were easy to pick up. VB might be it's a terrible language in retrospect, but it was really easy to pick up VB6 and
Yeah.
make useful stuff. But it was also the era where there was a lot of businesses processes that weren't automated at all
Mm-hmm.
yet. So there's just low hanging fruit every which
Yeah.
way for real simple applications that could help the business go faster.
Yeah, well, here's an example for you. As somebody who's been a consultant, I've been a consultant before, right? How many times have you gone to a customer and you're just talking to them and you're kind of learning about their business process? Like, oh, we have an Excel spreadsheet that does all of it, right? And like the question becomes like, if you didn't have to work in Excel, could you be more efficient? Not to say Excel isn't a good tool. Excel is a great tool, but there are like you could use a client app or a website or anything, right? Especially like if your Excel spreadsheet is literally just moving data, like it's data manipulation, right? Like, the amount of fat fingering that happens with Excel formulas is like 109%, right? How many times in your career do you think, just off the top, have you like gone to a customer and replaced Excel with something else, or Access database with something else?
Not recently, but a lot.
Yeah,
10,
over your
10 to 20
career,
years
over your
ago. It
career.
happened a
Yeah,
lot. Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's very interesting because there's so much, and especially when you're talking about like taking like analog workflows and making them digital. There was so much money to be made during that time because businesses, like most businesses, if they were like fancy, they had mainframes, or they had, they had some other systems that were already in place, and those systems are still around, sadly. But it is kind of interesting, like how you had like the quote unquote productivity tools that people would then turn into systems, right? Like I wonder if like the person, I can't remember his name, but like the guy who invented Excel, I wonder if he thought like 30 years ago, like, oh, like this thing that I'm building for like spreadsheets is going to be used by finance corporations, HR corporations, like all of like there's going to be whole domains that are dependent on this thing that it wasn't my job, it wasn't my goal, right?
Oh, I'm very sure they were pleasantly
Oh,
surprised by
sure.
what
Yeah,
they.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I think, I'd love to kind of talk a little bit more about your like engineering background. And the reason why I'm curious about it is that like there is this subset of technologists that like the physical like widgety parts of technology, like people that are makers and things like that. Like do you still have like that engineering, like that tactical like tangible, like I need to hold something and build something? Do you still have that itch, or has it gone away over time?
Not physical at all, and I wasn't really. Yeah, I was doing piping engineering. It's not that fun.
Sure.
No, but I still enjoy the creative process.
Yeah.
Inventing something out of whole cloth, building something. And at this point, it's refining things we've already built.
Yeah. Like you're not in AutoCAD like trying to like build like some weird thing, and like you open up and you're like, "Man, I still remember how to do all of this stuff."
No, no, I don't. And I've been around the people who are very, very good at AutoCAD and
Yeah.
MicroStation. They're a different breed of cat.
I met an engineer. I was at a conference and I was at a table having lunch, and I was talking to this guy, and I was like, "Oh, where do you work?" He's like, "Oh, I'm an engineer at AutoCAD." And I immediately was like, "Okay, I have to know everything." Cuz you're like the meta of all metas, right? Like you're building something that like thousands and thousands of people use, but like not for like it's like the problems you're trying to solve for an engineer are completely different than like what a typical technologist has like trying to solve, right? Like it's crazy.
Yes. I mean, there's a downside. It is when you go into consulting roles. Are you um, do you have enough empathy for the type of development that people doing feature work do?
Yeah.
I mean, I think I still do, but you're just dealing with a different problem set altogether. You're you're probably learning way too much minutia about the reflection API, as an example.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Or source generators now you can't use reflection. Not allowed. Not allowed anymore.
Well, oh no,
Yeah.
you're using reflection. Still using a form of reflection to figure out how to do your
Oh,
source.
sure. Yeah, yeah. My joke is like because eventually everything's like if you're in the .NET space, like there's this whole thing right now with native AOT where it's like you can't use reflection because yes, but like there's still like the need to do like oh I need to be able to iterate on the properties of this member or whatever, right? Like I just think it's funny because we're kind of replacing like a very like meta thing with an even more meta thing, and that's something that I think is pretty interesting. And I'd like to talk a little bit about at some point in this conversation about like the idea of like, the meta programming space in general, because you like with what you're doing with the critter stack is like you're kind of building tools for technologists to build tools or build platforms or whatever. But I think yeah, one of the things that's interesting to me specifically about some like your background about coming into technology late is that you kind of missed if you talk to kind of some people that are older, the joy, like oh I had to move bits around and do all these sort of things, and I was an assembler and all that stuff, and you kind of missed all of that. Like have you kind of gone down and like I'm curious, I want to know what it was like to like be a technologist way back then. Have you ever kind of gone back and tried to learn NASM or any of those sort of things?
I have not. Like I said, I did learn how to do Fortran in college, and that's
Yeah.
crude enough. That's not
Yeah.
assembly. So that's the Google Fiber mechanics. The story I would share is I heard from my engineering folks that in the old days they only had one mainframe that could do the calculations,
Mm-hmm.
and it was fed by the punch cards.
Yep.
So there was a shuttle that came around to all the satellite offices that would pick you up. You bring your box of your punch cards and go run it. It'd come by every hour. And just the challenge back then of how important it was to get your punch cards right the first time, because it's too hard to go back and forth. And then not only that, because they're trying to do everything to spec, they're grotesquely over designing everything because it's so expensive to calculate
Yeah.
whether or not something works or not. So, that kind of crudeness. Yeah, I'm okay missing out on that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I got started, my first job, I was doing like, back end, like line of business sort of apps for an insurance company, right? And like there was still a lot of stuff on mainframe, but they had like the reason why they hired me is because they were doing like .NET and classic ASP stuff. And like I said, I was kind of in that world in college and then whatever, right? But I remember having this conversation with this guy who was like a mainframe developer. I can't remember the technology, so unfortunately, it's probably not a great story. But like he was telling me, like he was kind of telling me about what he does, and he's like, "Oh, there's not very many of us left that still work." And I'm like, "Oh, what do you mean?" He's like, "Oh, I'm like one of like four, like of these sort of mainframe developers that are still working." And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, "Oh, like there's a community and like people will send like emails to this distribution list, and I'm like one of the four people that are still active on the distribution list." And I'm like, "No, that sounds horrible." And then I remember it, like, to build on top of that, like we had the CIO come, like it was a like a multinational, so there was like it's an Australian based company, but there had stuff in the US. And the CIO was doing like a tour, and he came to our office, and he makes eye contact with this guy, and he's like, "Lee?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Oh my gosh, like I know who you like." This guy's like a celebrity in his technology space, and like it's just so funny. Like the CIO of this company, who probably hadn't done anything like highly technical in 30 years, was like mildly fanboying over like some mainframe developer at an insurance company. It was wild.
I won't can't talk about it too much because it'll be too obvious who the client was. But I worked with a client where they were down to one developer on their mainframe language,
Yep.
and I don't think they were moving fast enough
Mm-hmm.
to have the mainframe stuff out before he wanted to retire.
Mm. Yeah, here's an interesting question for you, right? Like, I mentioned like I worked at this company that did a bunch of mainframe stuff and whatever, and like and they hired a couple of people like out of college to like maintain Fortran or COBOL apps, right? Like, I'd love to
Yeah.
get your thoughts for that, right? Like, could you imagine, like, probably now it's not as, I guess, typical, because like now, like I don't think anybody in college would maybe want to do that sort of work. Maybe, I don't know, but it's like, what are your thoughts about like coming in out of college and like your first job out of college is like maintaining like legacy tech, like not like old .NET 2.0 apps, but like
Yeah.
legacy tech, like techs that were like that's been around, like that was around before your parents were born.
So I don't have any firsthand
Yeah.
knowledge of that, but I see plenty. I see news stories about that several times a year, people doing that. It's probably not helpful to get you going in the rest of your career,
Yeah.
but it beats not having a job.
Yes.
And it's the constant struggle of there are very small technical niches that may be lucrative at the moment that aren't
Hmm.
great long-term
Yep.
approaches. And you're making you need to be making a conscious trade-off. I think you need to tell the young folks doing that, this is a trade-off you're making, and maybe
Yep.
that's okay, but you're making a choice here that may not work out in the longer run.
Yeah, I remember having this conversation because I worked with one of the guys that they got hired, and I was talking, like, "Don't you like, you didn't learn it in college?" He's like, "Well, how I see it is this: like, eventually, I'm gonna look for another job, and I've been paying attention to technology, and I'll just be able to find another job." And this is like, mid 2000s, right, or late 2000s, and he was a smart kid, but like he saw very much an opportunity to get a first job out of college, and he took it, right? Like this is like '08 time frame, so it's like you know finding jobs like stable jobs was kind of not a very easy thing to find. And but yeah, like I don't know, maybe as somebody who never had to like work day to day in COBOL, like just the thought of it like kind of gives me like this not does
Well,
not make me happy at all. But I'm also very like I don't like working on things I don't like working on.
so if you haven't, and nobody can throw anything at me over the screen, I can usually tell when it's an ex COBOL developer, no matter what language they're working in.
Interesting.
So there was, I think this is long, long gone, but in early COBOL days, there was a very serious performance problem for using subroutines of any kind.
Sure.
So if you see somebody that has just epically long, one main
Yeah.
function that's 4,000 lines of code, it's an ex-COBOL developer. I've seen it
Interesting.
in stored procedures, VB code, Perl. You know when it's an ex-COBOL developer.
Yeah, I've never thought about that because, like, I remember, especially when I was doing like contract work, consulting work, because I worked at like a big consulting company for one time, and there was a lot of like, hey, we need to update this legacy code to something else, and you would look at some apps, and it's like a web forms app, and it's like, why does your like ASPX pages, why do they have like 10,000 lines in them? Like I wonder if like I always assumed that was like an old school like VB thing or something, but maybe no, maybe it's probably from the golden age of mainframe development.
Yeah, VB probably didn't. There were people at VB that never thought about the code organization
Yeah,
because, I mean, you clicked on buttons and you put code in the event handlers. So you
yeah,
didn't really think about code organization. Kind of a lot like people using MVC Core today.
yeah. Oh, I mean, I would love to talk about
Tap that
like,
in.
yeah, I would love to talk about like current technology trends too. Like I think that's an interesting thing to talk about. So you kind of switch over, you kind of make this change in career progression where you're kind of looking at tech, those tech. So what was it specific? Was it just that .NET or like Microsoft Stack was like the first tech that you're interested to do for work, or was there something about that you enjoyed doing it so you've stuck with it for this long?
That's what uh, it's what I had access to at the time.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah,
what we happen to be using in the big engineering company. So Oracle databases, VB6, VBA. I was the one that started doing ASP Classic there for the first time
mm,
because we were all on Windows. It was easy. That was enough to parlay myself into my next job as a real developer. That was it was at Dell Computers. So
yeah,
we were very obviously on a Windows stack the whole
yep.
way through. So I was in the Microsoft development world as .NET hit. Continued on, one of the ringleaders of all .NET way back in the day, and then mostly just forgot to leave.
Well, that's not fair. I think like you could have left if like I always talk about this with communities. Like if they don't bring you joy anymore, like what's stopping you from hanging around, right? Like, and I wasn't very super prevalent like during like the altnet days. It was a little bit before my time, but like from what everybody talks about, it's like it just seems like it was so wild. Like people were just like doing crazy stuff, like trying to build some sort of community around this like very very popular at the time technology stack.
Yes, but it was trying to build a community that wasn't necessarily centered around Microsoft.
Sure.
Um, at the time, Microsoft was very much in a kind of a post VB6 funk. They were really, I think they were trying to constantly recreate the glory days of VB6.
Yeah.
And so this is all my interpretation, and this is ancient history, but I think it was the advent of Ruby on Rails that much more so than alt.NET that
Yeah.
really broke Microsoft out of what they were doing and
Hmm.
kind of put them on the trajectory that they're on now.
Yeah. I remember. So, like, just I don't typically do like a lot of prep for my guests, but like I was curious, so I kind of I googled your name and some stuff, and like I came across like an MSDN article that you wrote from like 2008 about alt.net, right? And I was like, oh, okay. I'm reading this, and I'm like, I don't remember any of this, like the details, but I remember kind of like the movement of things, right? Like during that time, I'd be curious to know, like, obviously there's some very very well known people in the .NET space are still around in the .NET space that were kind of part of that. Like, was it just like everybody just trying to like do their best because they saw that the tech was so interesting?
I wouldn't say, I don't know that I would say that. So there was,
Okay.
at the time, a lot of the alt.NET, it was being jealous of some other platforms.
Mm,
So this is not very many years. This is not very many years after agile development first became a
sure.
thing,
Sure.
and there was still a heavy infusion of the original idealism from extreme programming.
Yeah.
before Agile turned into Scrum and certified Scrum Masters and whatever SAFe is, and it was before Agile sucked, right? And when it was still a developer centric thing. So I would say my interpretation of the all.NET community, it was a lot of people who happened to be in .NET, but were very interested in Agile development. And the .NET tools, the very early tools, weren't very good for things like test-driven development, or you still had to put Visual Studio on your build server if you wanted to do CI back
Sure.
then. And there was a lot of us that were looking at things like Rails. Rails was the first time I saw it demoed, and comparing that to what we were doing with web forms at the time of, oh my God, they are blowing past us.
Sure.
Which all about the same time, not coincidentally. Wouldn't say that all.NET caused Microsoft to change, but I think the things that led to all.NET also led to Microsoft to change.
Yeah.
That was also the time that Scott Goo pushed. They started moving away from web forms to MVC. They started being a little bit more open, a little bit more community involved.
Yeah. Like I think of I do a talk on kind of like it's not the history of .NET, but it very much talks about like what the life of a .NET web developer has been over time, right? And I talk about like Codeplex, and I talk about how MVC like being open source was like a big deal and all of that. Like what was it in I don't want to kind of drill into this too much but I'm fascinated because it's something that I built my entire career on .NET, and I really, whenever I talk to people that were like in the weeds with like old .NET, I'm very curious as to like what the experience was like. Like when Microsoft starts to make a change, or the .NET team starts to make a shift to like open source. Open source is a thing because like Linux has been open source and Apache's been open source, but like to the enterprise, like open source was like we don't want to do that. Like what was it like? I'm at the time, were you doing client work, or was it kind of before you were doing that? Like I'd
Um,
love to know
I
like what
was
clients were thinking when like, oh, why is Microsoft all of a sudden like doing this free software thing?
I was in and out of consulting a couple times about that time. At that point, you could convince clients to use NUnit back then. This is even before
Mm.
actually. That was about the extent of it. You could convince clients to use NUnit and cruisecontrol.net. That was the very
Oh,
first
yep,
usable CI tool for .NET.
yep,
So shout out to former colleagues Owen Rogers and Mike Roberts. Um, that was the extent of it. You couldn't really slip things in. You IOC tools,
mm-hmm.
because Microsoft didn't have any equivalents for themselves yet.
Yep,
So you can slip a very few things in, but it was nowhere near like it is today,
sure,
where even very corporate centric, big enterprisey shops are probably using a lot of open source.
yeah. I, and at this time, were you interested in open source? Were you kind of apprehensive to the idea? Like, did you like the community around it? Like, I'm trying to figure out like when did you realize like, oh, open source is this thing that like I like. I'm gonna start building things in the open source.
So I wasn't there very long, but I was at ThoughtWorks in the early 2000s, just even less than 2 years. But it was really a formative time for me. So ThoughtWorks at the time, it was much more Java and Smalltalk and Ruby, but there was a very strong open source kind of ethos all the way through the company there. So the handful of us that were doing .NET within ThoughtWorks, it was just assumed that, well, of course you're going to do open source. So ThoughtWorks, cruisecontrol.net, and one of the very original incarnations of NUnit came out of ThoughtWorks about that time. This is in the very, very early
Yeah.
2000s. So, at one point in my mid 20s, I got stuffed into being a non-coding architect.
Mm.
And I was scared to death that was the end of my career, because
Sure.
I didn't have enough actual coding experience to go get another job, even though I'm technically an architect at a Fortune 500 company. So I started doing side projects. I thought I was going to build the ultimate object relational mapper in the very
Oh.
early 2000s.
Okay.
You'll notice that's not on my resume.
Mm.
Um, it failed, but a little sub piece of it, a little sub module of that failure turned into StructureMap, which
Yeah.
was the first production ready IOC tool in .NET. So that was in a production app in the summer of 2004. So
Mm.
that was my beginning of open source, and that was SourceForge, and you didn't really have any way to get people to even know about your
Yep.
stuff. Downloads. If you got 5 digits of downloads, you thought you were doing really awesome.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, it's crazy to think because .NET has been around for 22 years or whatever the number is, right? And like you just said 2004, so that's 20 years ago, right? So like we're talking about for a long time, like very .NET at the time, very enterprise, closed source, but like people are still trying to like build some things that are like extensions of the product, right? Because at the end of the day, it's just writing code. And you mentioned like StructureMap, and I think it's very interesting, like the idea of like building frameworks that extend the experience, right? Like, was this something that you had a particular need for in a job you were doing? And you built something and then you realized like, oh, like probably other people can use this? Or did you come up with it like there needs to be something like this that exists and you built it? Like I know that you kind of went down the path of ORM, but like, at some point you probably realized that wasn't going to work out.
Oh yeah, quite early on. Uh, I think I wanted to be, I was very young, very idealistic. I wanted to be a big shot of some
Sure.
sort. I,
Sure.
I wanted to prove myself. I wanted to go create things. And, at the time I was surrounded by so many people, or the company, there were so many people that went on to become celebrity programmers.
Sure.
The
Sure.
Dan North was in, I mean, a lot of these guys were in London, but they were there, they were building what became Gherkin, and the original version of Selenium came out of some of the people I was around. So it was like, I want to be like that. This is something I enjoy doing. And frankly, I enjoy tinkering and building my own stuff. There's something that's so different and satisfying about building your own vision instead of rolling up work and being handed a bunch of use cases
Yeah.
and going to a bunch of meetings and, you know, not trying to depress anybody, but the
Yeah.
ability to have complete control and over your own technical vision,
Yeah.
that's something that's so much more satisfying.
Oh, I mean, it's also nice to feel acknowledged too, right? Like you mentioned, like the
Definitely.
celebrity thing. I mean, I hate to tell it to you, Jeremy, but I just looked because I was curious. Like you're kind of a celebrity. Like I looked at NuGet, you have like over 110 million downloads of miscellaneous things that you've built on NuGet.org. So like, I mean, that's kind of rarefied air. So like, I think that you might be a bit of a celebrity. I hate to tell you.
I'm also old, so I've been around a while.
Well, I mean, let's not discount that. Vintage is probably the better way to say it, right? Um, so I'd love to kind of talk to as we kind of transition into one of the reasons why I want to talk to you about this, like the idea of building like tools for developers. We were talking about this a little bit, right? When did you like realize that you kind of had a knack for like because I think there's two kinds of developers typically. Like that's a gross exaggeration, but this is how I see it. There are developers who build for companies, like build products, I think is the better way to phrase it, like build products. And there are developers that build tools, and there's some interlap and all of that. But like when did you realize that you enjoyed like building tools?
Oh, right off, absolutely right off
Yeah.
the bat. Yeah,
Yeah.
that almost immediately.
Was it because of some of the things that we mentioned earlier, like the, wanting to, contribute, maybe wanting to be famous a bit? Or is it just like, I've dealt with enough pain as a developer, as a consultant, working with clients or whatever, right? Like, if somebody was there to build tools that can make a developer's life better, like, I want to be a part of that. Is there any kind, and the reason why I'm kind of digging in this just a little bit is like, I feel like there is a very specific kind of personality that likes to build like open source tools for developers, in my opinion. Like, there's a bit of empathy. There's a little bit of wanting to like send the ladder back down or whatever like cliche phrase you want to use. Do you subscribe to any of that, or you're just like, nah, like it's just interesting. Like solving these sort of problems is more interesting than doing like forms over data work or some building CRUD apps for clients or whatever.
So it is more interesting but and to some degree, in the middle, it took on being the goal all by itself,
Yeah.
probably wrongly, and probably in family unfriendly ways. Get that one out there. There's a huge amount of gratification in now where I'm finally at, seeing people use your tools, but seeing your tools accelerate their own efforts.
Hmm.
I won't say that it works out for everybody, but the people that take the tools and are able to run with it and use it the way that you kind of meant to, and be able to see, yeah, this is adding so much more value. It's helping them go so much faster. It's enabling them to build maybe better systems. That's extremely gratifying. And for the last 10 to 15 years, I wanted this to be how I made my living,
Hmm.
with one just wretched, massive failure at the beginning of this,
Sure.
to the point where hopefully this is maybe starting to work out a little bit just now.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak to it as an external person. Like, I think that the things that you have built, they provide a value that didn't exist in the market. And I think anytime that, you know, people create a company or create like something that's a revenue stream, like that is the first question is like, does it provide some value to the market? And can we get it in front of the right people, right? Because I think that's the hardest part, right? Whenever you're building anything, it's like,
Yes.
how are people gonna find my thing? And I've talked to other friends that have done similar things, or they've been employee number two at a company or whatever, and it's if they have to close, they're like, what do you think the problem is? Honestly, we couldn't find the market fit. Like we thought the tech was good, we thought that it solved a problem, but like we couldn't get it in front of the right people for it to actually be sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, with technical tooling, there's a special problem in the .NET space of, can you break through that it's not a Microsoft tool?
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
it's really hard to get attention for things that aren't coming out of Redmond.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think that's actually been our biggest problem. And you feel like you're doing so much. You're writing blog posts. You're going to conferences. Going on the .NET Rocks guys have been very generous. They've let me go on a couple times,
Yeah.
and you still run into people all the time that have never heard of anything
Yeah.
you've done. It's
Sure.
yeah, I don't have the answers for that. And
Yeah.
if anybody does, please send them to me.
Sure. No, I'll put out I'll send out a signal. It's like, hey, if you know how to like really amplify products so it can just make everybody who works there millions and millions of dollars, like let me know. I got a friend who's looking for sort of that sort of stuff. But it is true. Like I think good, bad, or indifferent, and I've talked about this a lot. We don't need to drill into it a ton, but like there is a bit of weight building tools for a very well-known framework that happens to be managed by the biggest company in the world, right? Like, I mean, good, bad, or indifferent. Like, one, there's tons of competition. Like, I say this about open source and about meta tools in general. It's like everybody has like their own opinionated version of how to solve some problem, and
Sure.
in your case, like you want to do it a particular way. You might talk to somebody who's building a similar tool, like, oh, they're doing it a little bit different. Like, but do the tools do something similar? Yeah, because at the end of the day, like all tools are kind of commodities. It's how they fit into your existing business process, which is super interesting. And that kind of leads me to like I want to talk about the things that you've been building over the last X amount of years, right? Like, when did you realize and I don't know which order of which of the tools, because in the critter stack there's a bunch of them, and the names are great, but like I don't know the history a ton. Like, kind of give me a little bit of an intro to like why did you decide to start building like event sourcing tools, relational database tools? Like, when did you start like, hey, I want to like this is the thing that I want to try to tackle?
Sure. So, and it's going to come out. My biggest success was an accident. Um, so, roll back long enough in the early 2010s. I was one of the founders and the eventual technical leader of an alternative web application framework called Fubu MVC.
Mm-hmm.
Total failure. You don't need to go look it up. And it also had a service bus functionality off to the side of it. I don't even know if we ever promoted. That was going to be my big thing. It was going to be my crowning achievement. I was going to make a living off that. It was just crushing defeat. But a lot of lessons, a lot of stuff that's even in Wolverine today. There's a lot of Wolverine's approach is informed by that earlier failure. So Marten came about. I was in a shop where we were using RavenDB. That's an alternative NoSQL database for the .NET platform, and we were using it. This is very early in RavenDB's history, so it wasn't very mature itself yet. And then we were doing some dramatically stupid things with it anyway. So Marten came about when we needed to replace RavenDB in a hurry. Okay. So we were given like 6 months, get it ripped out of there. So we built Marten originally on top of Postgres to mimic what Raven did. So the name Marten came about when my boss was giving me a hard time about the code name I was using at the time. So I Googled what are the natural predators of ravens, and Martens will steal raven eggs. So Marten was built to replace RavenDB for us. That's the document database side of it. Yeah. And while I was there, just really as kind of a hobby, I had played around with event sourcing on top of Postgres the previous year in a big prototype POC, and I felt like it had just been a waste of time. So, hey, I'm going to just bolt on a little basic event sourcing capability onto the side of Marten while I'm at it. That's turned out to be the thing that everybody loves. Yeah. Because it is the one and only thing in the .NET ecosystem where you can get event sourcing, projections, the read side, everything in one box. It's very easy to spin up with Docker. I think it has a very good getting started story. And that's where almost all our usage came from. And it just exploded. Wolverine is actually older, and it's something I've been working on for years and years to be an eventual replacement for that old FUBU thing, because I can't just let a failure go, right? As Marten became very popular and we decided, hey, it would be valuable if we dusted this what's now Wolverine off the shelf, rebuild it a little bit, and make it work really well with Marten so we could create this very low friction, very low ceremony way of building CQRS applications. So we purposely renamed it to Wolverine to fit with Marten. Yeah. And there's a helper Weasel, so that became the critter stack. Yeah. You know, once somebody said the name, another guy gave us the emblem right off the bat, and I think the decision was made in 30 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, it's fun because it's, I think in this, funny enough, I was having this conversation the other day about naming things. And there are some companies that go down the path of naming things like very generic, like X Studio or X Suite, or it's like, and then there's other companies that they just name their things like really weird things. And I like that, even though it probably doesn't make sense in a lot of business sense to name something some weird name, but at least you have more access to the dictionary. Because at the end of the day, and the defense of this point I was trying to make into this individual was all of these things kind of do the same thing. So you have a very small subset of the words of the English language that you can actually leverage. But if you instead say have a little bit of whimsy, you have access to all this stuff. The fact that you're able to how many, I don't know what family Weasel and Wolverine, what animal family they're in.
Mustelagen? I can't say it right. Yeah. Mustelagen.
But there's more than 6 of them. 6 animals in that thing, right? So, if you grow this into a, 20 different products at some point, you're not going to run out of names.
Not for a while. We know the next couple. We know the next couple code names.
Oh, fun! You don't got to spoil them here, obviously. But
I don't want to slot on a nougat.
Yeah, cool. So one of the things that's interesting too about the things we've been talking about specifically is the idea to, make money, or not make money is not the best way to phrase it, but provide, enterprise or production support for open source tools, right? We've had a couple of people on this show before that have kind of, been down a similar path, and I'd love to kind of get your thoughts. You don't need to tell me all the pain stories, but obviously it's a pretty big jump, like going from, somebody is paying your bills to, I'm paying my bills because I own this company and I have some people that I trust a ton to work with to build these things out. Like, what was your thought process around kind of making that jump? You mentioned earlier, like, I've always wanted to kind of like, make money off of something I built. But like,
Mhm.
obviously wanting to do that versus actually doing that is a big of a leap.
So I kind of mostly given up on the idea,
Mm,
after that Fubu thing failed so miserably. But Martin was growing quite a bit.
yep.
I had what is now Wolverine. I'd been working on off and on for years, and a couple people had been encouraging me to do this. Somebody out kind of nowhere, DM me off to the side in Twitter. He was actually just leaving a company that built something similar to Martin, and just, what are you doing? Why aren't you monetizing this yet? And
Yeah.
this other company in the Java space just got $3 million in VC
Yeah.
money, and man, you're wasting you're wasting yourself.
Sure.
Um, it actually. So I'm an overcautious person. It took a lot of encouragement from my wife and a lot of people around me to kind of nudge out of, yeah, you can do this. So maybe try my advice is maybe try to do it younger than I did.
Mm, interesting. Uh, I wonder too, and like we don't need to delve into this too much, but like I wonder if it's too is that you knew that you had people that you can trust to kind of go in it with you together, right? Like for folks that don't know, like the Critter Stack has a couple of other like key folks to it. It's not just Jeremy, right? Like so, was it the fact that like you kind of already had a team of people that were like core maintainers, people that loved the stuff that you were building together? Was that part of it too, or was that dynamic even harder? Because like, oh, we're all gonna kind of like ride this ship together. That's kind of scary.
Well, so core team. So Oscar Dudix right now is, I don't think it's an exaggeration. Oscar is kind of setting himself up. He's becoming the Martin Fowler of event sourcing and
Yeah.
CQRS right now. He is the guy for modeling event workflows now. So they were, and Babu is our third core member. Babu is now helping Jasper FX directly. Um, they were all eager to do this too,
Mhm.
or I think they would probably say that I was the one dragging my heels.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean it's fascinating to me because one, like a lot when a lot of people like you talk to I'm just gonna throw out some RAM thing like you talk to like Jimmy Bogart with Mediator Automapper, right? Not to throw Jimmy under the bus, but like that's the person I think of is like, oh, like he's the face and he does all the things and whatever, right? Like it almost seems to me like it's a if okay, well, this is my idea, this is my thing. If it doesn't work out, it's just me. But when you start to add people to it, there's a responsibility there. But it's interesting to hear that you were like the person that was cautious, and they're like, "Come on, Jeremy, like this is a thing, let's do it." And you're like, I don't know. I wonder if it's like is it just your cautious nature? Do you think is what it was mostly?
Big risk averse,
Yeah,
and it has not been an easy thing to get started. Um,
sure.
the work life boundaries are really fuzzy
Yeah, yeah.
right now. Hoping the better days are coming soon as revenue streams go up.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's been pretty challenging. I don't know that I have any huge advice for other people wanting to do it, but I mean, pay attention to what the identity server folks have done. Particular the Aka.net folks. I mean, there's
Yeah,
Chili Cream. I mean, there's 6 or 7 tool companies in .NET that aren't Microsoft. They're starting to go now, or
yeah.
have been for a while.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I was actually thinking about this a couple of weeks ago about like over the last probably 5 years, there's been this all of a sudden. I mean, there was like .NET Nuke like a long time ago, and there's been like companies that have been spun up of like .NET Tool or .NET Framework sort of things. Um, but like I've seen it definitely seems more recently, and I wonder if it's just because there's becoming a more interested approach to like production support of open source tooling that is almost like a necessity for a lot of these folks. Like,
Mhm.
what do you think it really is? Do you think, because you mentioned like 4 or 5 companies, there's more than that in the last 5 years that have been spun up from like, hey, we have this tool that people have been using, and random employee at large company is like opening GitHub issues. Like, they should probably get some sort of level of support that like values them a bit higher up than just random GitHub issues, right?
Yeah, so I mean, there's several issues there. I think the open source success, there's some obsessiveness to it one way or another on the part of the author. I mean, there's the feeling of I'm working way too hard for other people. I know
Mm.
for me, it was just the kind of the accidental nature of my career path. I felt like I was adding vastly more value as an open source author than I was in my day jobs.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair.
Honestly, felt like I was far more valued. But you also start feeling like I'm giving away such a tremendous amount of value for free.
Yeah.
And then you start running into a lot of people at conferences in Oslo. We got the same thing. We got a lecture of, hey, I mean, this stuff looks great, but you can't use this if it's just like you two or
Mm.
three guys doing this
Yeah.
on the side.
Yeah.
You need to have a company behind it. You need to do support contracts.
Yeah.
Um, we've already talked to that person about a support contract, of course.
Of course.
But a lot of these tools, they aren't viable. They're not sustainable unless there is some kind of revenue model.
Hmm.
So the support contract is kind of necessary. And we do run into some of our early adopters are telling us that, hey, we really just we want this to be sustainable.
Yeah.
You know, they don't even, it's not even really clear that they're going to use the support contract that much, but we need to depend on this. We need to keep it going.
I mean, if a company can toss you some money to ensure that the product is that the tool and the product is going to have life, like that's value. That's value right there, right? Because we've all seen it. If you've been in the open source space, like how many times have we seen some tool, like the developer got a job somewhere else, they stopped using the tech, maybe they thought they were feature complete, whatever, they just kind of abandon a repository, or they
Sure.
mark it as deprecated and they're like, I don't want to, this doesn't bring me joy anymore, like, and it's not worth like spending like 15-20 hours a week like maintaining this repo. I don't want to do it anymore. And then like all these people, whether they're independent or they work at companies, are like, oh well, now what do we do? Like, that's a scary thing, right?
It is. I haven't seen very many open source tools successfully transition from the original author somewhere else.
Yeah.
And honestly, the only project I've ever worked on that I successfully transitioned to someone else was Jimmy Bogart took over a small library called HTML tags from us years
Yeah.
ago because he wanted it.
Yeah. No, it is definitely, yeah. I think that one, I think really you have to have a passion for something, right? Like, you can't just pick up something and you can't just hold on to something forever either. Like, I've had this conversation a ton of times on the show where it's like, if you're an open source maintainer and the project that you maintain no longer brings you joy, what are you doing? Right? Like,
Yeah.
and you know, maybe a way to kind of circumvent that is if you turn it into some sort of revenue stream. Maybe it does bring you joy in a different way.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
So my morning was spent. We are about to launch paid add-on products to the
Mm.
Critter Stack for companies that need to do huge amounts of data or need to do blue-green deployment or zero downtime deployments. So we actually have a customer that sponsored a big chunk of this work to build it for them, but that's going to become our
Yeah.
first paid add-on product.
That's awesome. I mean, and that's the first one, right? And then I don't want, like, knock on wood, I will not be surprised if when this thing becomes public, you're just going to get a lot of folks that are just like, oh yeah, give me this now. And then you're like, and then you're kind of, it paid itself off, right? The investment paid itself off, because I think that's the one thing you mentioned a bit earlier. It's like companies are apprehensive about open source tools until they
Yes.
see something that makes it look enterprisey, right? And as long as something looks enterprisey to them, they're like, okay, I know for a fact, if I pick up the phone, Jeremy's going to answer, or Oscar's going to answer, or whoever's going to answer, and life will be good. Like, we'll be okay. And like, at the end of the day, like that's what these companies want is someone for stability.
Definitely that. But at the same time, you've still got to have a model where a small ragtag tag team can pick it up and use it very easily.
Yeah.
So you got to have both that very easy getting started story with the ability to scale up to massive quantities of data and be able to say, prove, hey, this is around, it's proven, we're going to be here.
Yeah, and I mean, and this is a great place to end too, because I think, you know, it's just an example of what the open source community do can do if people are just introduced to it. Like, over the last 6 months specifically, I've seen so much traction about Wolverine and Marten specifically, and I'm excited because I I believe in the fact that you folks care so much about the product, right? And it's only a matter of time before more and more people are aware of it, and then it becomes a thing. And I'm happy for you because you mentioned earlier, like this is kind of what I wanted to get into, and maybe there's a little bit of a delay, but you're here now, and I think that's awesome.
I appreciate that. I do want to give a big shout out. We've had a great community around both tools. Wolverine, especially, it's been a lot of community members that pushed it the way that it is now. The idea is that it wouldn't have occurred to me years ago. So, it's more than just the three of us. And y'all just want you to know, really appreciate it. I appreciate the bug reports, appreciate the reproduction reports, and just the patience with all of us.
Yeah, I mean, it without having a community around something, like it's very, very hard to get any traction. I think that's very, very clear because, we talked about passion a bit earlier, right? Like once you find your kind of your tribe's not the best word, but once you find your group of people that like are passionate about solving a particular problem, they'll go above and beyond to make sure that like everything is exactly the way it should be. And I think that's great for community. It's great for you folks. It's great for your customers. It's great for like I said, the entire tribe. This conversation's been great. Jeremy, it's been great to kind of learn your background a little bit, get your thought process into some things. This has been a joy. Before we sign off, I do like to ask my guests like one final like silly question, and that question is it's pretty broad, but hopefully it's not painful for you. So if you can kind of think about we've talked for an hour. If you can think about what you've been doing over the last 30 years in the tech space, going from building back end stuff to doing contract work for clients, and now building like open source stuff for the community and for clients. But you only had a couple of words to think about, like that feeling that you get as we've kind of talked for the last hour. What would that feeling be, or those words be for you?
What I want to have happen, or what it is.
In
Trying to
general.
build something good.
Yeah.
Trying to build something good that I can be satisfied with.
Build something
that
good.
can come with pride later.
Yeah, build something good is pretty solid, because I think at the end of the day, we're all like, if you're a developer and you care about technology, like you just want to like build something that's good. And I mean, good is 6 months good is not. Yeah, exactly.
And people actually use.
And people actually use. That's true. This has been great. For folks that want to learn more about what Jeremy's doing, you can find Tim, like you mentioned earlier, on Twitter, Jeremy D. Miller. That's JeremyDMiller. You can also find a link to some other places, as well as a link to the Critter Stack and Wolverine and Marten in the show notes. And this has been great. Before we sign off, my friend, do you have any parting words?
No, other than, hey, folks, life's short. Seize your opportunities when they come in. And when something's working for you in your career, cut that off fast and shut it down.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, was the Carpe Diem, right? Like the corniest of corniest tags, right? Like it's definitely important to look for things that bring you joy. And I'm glad that I was able to talk with you, because this definitely brought me some joy. And as we wrap up, I want to thank folks for tuning in live here, as well as the folks that are listening in the future. My name is Isaac Levin. This has been Coffee and Open Source. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.